Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Bradley Woodworth. He is the Coordinator of Baltic Studies at Yale University and Assistant Professor of History at the University of New Haven. His research interests include the social and political history of the multi-ethnic Baltic provinces and the broader northwestern regions of Imperial Russia, including St. Petersburg and Finland. Today we'll talk with Professor Woodworth about the most recent volume he co-edited with Karsten Brüggemann of Tallinn University, entitled Russia on the Baltic: Imperial Strategies of Power and Cultural Patterns of Perception, 16th to 20th Centuries. Welcome, Professor Woodworth.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's begin with you giving us an overview of the book. Tell us about it.
Right, so this book is a collaborative effort. 17 scholars are involved. And these are scholars that have been writing over the last few years about the historical relationship between the Baltic region. This is understood in our scholarship here as the territories that today comprise the states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The scholars are writing about this region with regard to its relationship with the Russian Empire, as well as the Soviet Union, in new ways that breaks with scholarship that had dominated in the 20th century. For decades, the scholarship, the historiography about this region focused on imperial domination from the capitals of St. Petersburg in the imperial period and Moscow in the Soviet period, with the Baltic region and its peoples being more or less passive recipients of this domination and violence. Now, with my co-editor, we'd never downplay in any way this history of violence, particularly in the 20th century. But we feel that now, with 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, it's time to reassess the broader and deeper historical relationship between the imperial center and this particular borderland of what was a very multi-ethnic Russian Empire and Soviet Union, and look at it in new ways and see what areas of the historical relationship have been maybe misunderstood or downplayed because of this reigning paradigm of violence and domination.
Now, how did you go about, did you invite these people to provide you with paper? Did it grow out of something else? Or how did the book actually get written?
Well, so between the two of us, we have a lot of contacts among scholars working on the Baltic region, as well as the multi-ethnic Russian Empire. We attended conferences in Europe on Baltic affairs and Baltic history, as well as in North America. And from several conferences, we saw some commonalities in approach among these scholars, and so we approached them about this idea and found a publisher in Bulau. And the project took a little bit longer than I think we had anticipated, but we're very pleased with the result.
Okay, let's talk about some of the perceptions or insights that the book brings to light.
Right. So the main one, as I mentioned before, is that the relationship between an imperial center and its peripheries. The Russian Empire had a number of peripheral regions on its borderlands in the north, on the west, and on the south, and then later in the 19th century acquiring Central Asia. Its history with Siberia, also historically a non-Russian region, goes back a number of centuries. The historical experience with these non-Russian areas was central to the identity of the Russian Empire. With the region that we're studying, we're determined that in the last couple hundred years, the relationship, though has in this historiography been dominated by this discourse of violence and domination, there are a lot of other things that were going on. So we're hoping to reopen these questions of the relationship between center and periphery.
Now, when you were editing the papers, did you come across anything that was particularly surprising to you? Anything you weren't expecting?
Yeah. I think one thing that was a little bit unexpected is how long it took to produce the book.
How long did it take?
Well, it took about 5 years, actually.
Okay.
Some of the papers were originally delivered in 2007 and 2008, I believe, and so we approached the authors and started working on them. And I found that the process of putting together a multilingual volume with a publisher outside of the United States and authors who whose native language ranges across the board. We had authors from 6 different countries and I guess 5 different languages. Really was a time-consuming effort because we wanted to make sure that the final product reflected the quality of the research of those scholars. So we spent quite a bit of time working on those chapters and editing them and going back and forth with the authors. Among the 17 chapters, 9 are in English. Those are the ones that I edited, and Professor Brüggemann edited the 8 chapters in German.
Okay.
And among the 9 chapters that I worked on, including the introduction that Professor Brüggemann and I co-wrote together in English, there was only one other chapter that was written by a native English speaker. And so there was spent quite a bit of work working on those chapters.
Quite a melting pot and quite, I think, a variety of perspectives then as a result of people coming from different countries.
Yeah, so this is one thing that both Professor Brüggemann and I have noticed. Interestingly, neither of us have our own, in a sense, personal historical ties to the region.
Okay.
This is a part of the world that requires a lot of languages to understand, and so it's understandable that often scholars that are interested in the region have some sort of personal contact, maybe within their family. But Professor Brüggemann is originally from Germany. I have no family ties to the Baltic region, but for a number of reasons found myself having spent over 4 years in the former Soviet Union and 3 years in Estonia. So we found that there were an increasing number of scholars like us that were, I think, probably coming to the region with a new set of eyes over the last few decades. During the existence of the Soviet Union, the kinds of historical writings on the Baltic region, I wouldn't say were completely dominated by this discourse of violence and imperial ambitions from the center, to rule and to let everyone know that they were subject peoples. But it's understandable that that sort of discourse existed. I mean, the history of the Baltic region, beginning in 1940 when it was first occupied by the Soviet Union, all the way up to 1991, was one of violence. In 1941 in the summer, tens of thousands of people from each of the 3 countries that had been independent between World War I and World War II, here speaking of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, were exiled to Siberia, and many of those people never, of course, ever returned. Many people left those countries as political refugees fleeing Soviet occupation. So even after the war ended, the violence then continued when the Soviet Union reoccupied the country and again deported people to Siberia. Over the next few decades, there were hundreds of thousands of people brought from outside the Baltic region, but from other areas of the Soviet Union to work in new growing factories. And so the demographic picture of these countries changed dramatically. So far that in Latvia in particular, by the late 1980s, the percentage of the population living in the country that was ethnically Latvian was approaching 50%, which means that in the country that is, the homeland of a people, they could have found themselves minorities, and the demographic picture was also quite dire in Estonia. So the problematic relationship with the Eastern power of Russia and the Soviet Union, Professor Brüggemann and I completely understand. But the fact is that from the 18th century and even earlier, this was a multi-ethnic region. People of differing ethnicities, differing religions, differing languages lived together. No one in the 18th century or 19th century knew that there was going to be this thing called modern nationalism, that people would divide themselves according to, in some ways, a somewhat artificial category of nationalism, because nation can fall along a number of different lines, dividing one nation from another, or that the Russian Empire would even collapse in World War I. Nobody foresaw that. So people lived together for 200 years. They worked on problems together. Yes, there were patterns of people dominating when there was a local elite in the Baltic region. These were people, for the most part, who had historical ties to Germany. Or rather, they were Germans, I should say. Germany itself doesn't become a unified state until the 19th century. But one of these minorities in the Baltic region, that is today Latvia and Estonia, were Baltic Germans. And these people had long-standing ties in the country. Many of them had arrived in the Middle Ages, so they had been there a long time.
Yeah.
And they had developed historical ways of dealing with local populations. And during the 19th century in particular, and in the 20th century, those historical relations started to be overturned by the Soviet Union.
Okay, so if there was one thing that you'd like your reader to take away, what would it be?
Yeah, a number of things. I think the main thing that invigorates both my scholarship as well as Professor Brüggemann's is this reality of multi-ethnic societies. What makes them run? What makes them work? when do they work successfully? What kind of problems do they have? I can give you one example from Karsten Brüggemann's essay. He writes about how in the 19th century, when Russia was beginning to have a stronger hold on the Baltic region, a stronger presence, the Russians who were writing about the region, and this included historians, included publicists, and other writers, were very much attracted to the region. This was a region that had a higher level of culture, a higher level of literacy than Russia proper, and they realized the strong role of culture bringers, Kulturträger, that the Germans had been. But on the other hand, they were trying to reimagine this multi-ethnic area as something that belonged to a multi-ethnic Russian Empire, which saw itself as having a civilizing mission, a mission civilisatrice. And so there was a very interesting process of give and take, really, between local populations in the center in coming up with a new identity for this region within the Russian Empire. Another article by Evgeny Nazarov, an interesting, great scholar from Russia, writes about how Latvians in the 19th century, who became educated to the point that they didn't always find a place for them to work in the Baltic provinces, often left to Russia and had careers there in postal service, in the military, across the board. Another scholar from Estonia in the collection writes about how in the 19th century there were cultural transfers from the Baltic to Russia, again with many areas of scholarship and science being at higher levels in the Baltic than in Russia. There were things that the Baltic could actually offer Russia, and one that she writes about are cultural transfers in the area of agriculture, where Baltic Germans were able to show colleagues in Russia how to make better use of the land. So this is the thing that has always really interested us about this multi-ethnic region. And another couple other things I say come out of the book, and that is that multi-ethnic regions really can't be seen, or shouldn't be seen rather, as a land where there's on the one hand an imperial power that dominates over local supine populations. These are shared regions. It doesn't mean that everybody's living happily at the same time, but they really need to be looked at as a whole, and not just in terms of, in this case, for example, Russia on the one hand and Baltic on the other, Russian interests versus Baltic interests. We really see them as together. This is a shared territory, and we're trying to understand it on those shared terms. And then finally, what emerges from the region, so both of us have a deep commitment to the Baltic region, and that comes clear, I think, comes out in the book. But we're also trained as Russian historians, and this book, I think, plays a part in the really the dominant theme right now in studying the Russian Empire, and that is the issue of its multi-ethnicity. It never got the time it deserved in past decades, particularly while the Soviet Union existed. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been a new boom in scholarship about these non-Russian areas. And so our book, I think, helps scholars in approaching this question. What was this thing called Imperial Russia? You know, was it a nation state in embryo? Was it multiple nation states in embryo? Was it imperial center with autonomous regions? Was it a multi-ethnic empire? Well, it was all of these. It was various historical actors had their own visions of what it was, and I think we really have to go back and look at what these historical actors saw themselves as doing. What did they see themselves as trying to create? in this multi-ethnic empire.
Right.
And we hope our book is a contribution to understanding that.
Fascinating. Do you have any other projects lined up? What
Well,
are you working on now?
Thank you. Yes, I'm completing a book on Tallinn in the second half of the 19th century, and it looks at some of the similar issues. This was a multi-ethnic city, and one where social change, growing national identity, were all taking place at the same time. I take a somewhat optimistic view of the 19th century and seen it one as of great possibilities. And so I'll hopefully finish that fairly soon. And I'm also working on an interesting fellow who probably is the most famous Finn of all time.
Okay.
His name is Gustav Mannerheim, who himself was not a so-called ethnic Finn, but actually a Finnish Swede. Swedish was his native language. And he was born in what was the Russian Empire. Finland was part of the Russian Empire in the 19th century, and wanted to become a military man, and he did. And he became eventually a general in the Tsar's army. Well, he had an entire career before World War I took place. But with World War I, the collapse of Imperial Russia, Finland found itself vying for independence, and he ended up entering a whole new career of his life, which then carries forward later in his later years. He ended up as the head of the Finnish forces in World War II. But he's one of these figures whose life isn't bounded, right, by either of these stories, an imperial center or a local nation, one particular identity. His own life was a multi-ethnic one. And the richness of that experience, and I think the ways that it can communicate to societies today, shouldn't be lost.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. For more information about Professor Woodworth and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.